Good morning, everyone. My name's Palab Ghosh. I'm one of the BBC science correspondents, and I tend to cover science policy and Brexit, so this is an area of great interest to me, as it is to you. We're talking about the impact of Brexit on UK research and European research, and we've got a fantastic panel to discuss all of this. We have Julie Girling, who's an independent MEP for South West of England and Gibraltar. She was elected in 2009 as a member of the Conservative Party, and she joined the European Conservatives and Reformist Parliamentary Group. We have Professor Graeme Reid, Chair of Science and Research Policy at University College London, with a particular interest between the relationship between taxpayers and the science community. Dr. James Briscoe, who is a senior group leader at the Francis Crick Institute in London, Europe's largest biomedical research laboratory, and having quite a lot of scientists from the European Union who must be feeling very confused and wondering what to do. We have Dame Helen Wallace, Professor Dame Helen Wallace, who's a fellow of the British Academy and is specialising in European integration and comparative European politics. From 2011 to 2015, she was a Foreign Secretary and International Vice President of the British Academy. And we have Lord Taverne. He has been a Liberal Democrat peer since 1996, and he sat on the Lords EU Subcommittee on Economic and Financial Affairs and International Trade. And from 2004 and 2008, he was a member of the Science and Technology Committee. Now, the organisers did invite representatives from DEGSU, the Secretary of State, a minister, officials, and there was no response. They have tried extremely hard to get balance in this discussion, but they declined the opportunity to make their views known. The speakers here are all opposed or concerned about the impact of Britain leaving the European Union on the research base. So if I sound as if I'm being sharp or questioning them, I think that's my role, to balance up any absence of people supporting the British exit from the European Union. Now, the format is that each of the speakers will make a few introductory comments. I'm going to keep them very tight, because what's important is you've come all this way not just to listen, but to ask questions and to enter the discussion. So, speakers, I'll ask you to restrict your comments to 5 minutes, and if after 7 you haven't stopped talking, I'll ask Cameron, our sound man, to cut off your microphones.
Brutal.
So, Julie, can I ask you to make your introductory remarks, please?
Yes, thanks, and good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm very delighted to be here, and it's a very distinguished company, and you've sandwiched that between two politicians, which is quite clever. I don't claim to have any special knowledge in this subject area, in the sense of I'm not a scientist, I've never been a researcher. However, as a member of the European Parliament right from the beginning, I have been involved very much in a movement towards impressing the philosophy of science-based policy making. And that can be more widely viewed as evidence-based policy making, but I have been involved in areas which really are about pure science. And I do believe that the UK, of course, punches way above its weight in terms of funding, but I will leave others to talk about that in detail. I think my position on this panel really is maybe to tell you just a little bit about how the political situation is in Brussels at the moment, and a little bit about how the European Parliament that I sit in will be involved and may be able to influence how we go in the future. So firstly, just starting off, the government's paper, which I'm sure you've all read, on this subject says, and I'm quoting, an ambitious agreement, an ambitious agreement for continuing the cooperation. And we've all read it, and it's got a lot of very good intentions, but it hasn't got really any detail on how this is going to happen. So the first question really is it realistic? can we have this full cooperation? And I'm going to examine that from the Brussels point of view. At the moment, sitting in the Parliament, at the beginning of October, we passed a resolution. We have what's known as a Brexit working group, which is a member of each of the political groups, which are amalgamations of political parties from the 28 member states. A member of each of those groups sits on a panel. And it's headed up by a Liberal, Guy Verhofstadt, an ex-Prime Minister of Belgium, so very high-profile member of the Parliament. And we do not have, in the process, an official part. The process is between the Council, that's the governments of the 28 member states, and the Commission. And then the Commission are tasked to deliver for the Council in the form of Michel Barnier, who has become a quite well-known figure now in the UK, much to his surprise. So, where does the Parliament comes in? That we consider the implications across a number of areas, and as you know, the main areas to be dealt with first are citizens' rights, and that's a big issue for this gathering today, because one of the problems with Brexit is the status of researchers and experts living and working in the UK who've never had to think about it before. It's just been, if you're an EU citizen, you simply can. And of course, everyone knows that maybe that's not going to be the case. But what will we be able to do? So that's been high on the list. Also Northern Ireland, which perhaps not an issue for today, but worth mentioning as a major priority. And then the UK's exit bill, which is worth mentioning because the UK have said that they will honour Horizon 2020 commitments, but of course there is a limited pot of money, so it's useful to know what that Brexit bill is going to be. So in Brussels, we look over at the United Kingdom, and I have to say I'm going to give you a little vignette from a Swedish colleague who said to me not very long ago, you know, Julie, we always look to the UK for sense, rational thinking, pragmatic behaviour. We see them as part of the European scene, as being the ones that draw us back from the too big vision that can't be achieved, the ones who say, look, hang on, this has got to happen in a practical way. He said, and now we're just sitting there, and he did this hand movement, watching the television, thinking, what the hell is going on? What has happened to our rational friend? So, first thing to remember is that in Brussels we view this, it is viewed, they all speak English, they all read our newspapers, they're readily available on the internet. There is no lack of communication, they know exactly what's going on here. So when a politician from the Prime Minister down goes anywhere, Florence, Brussels, wherever you like, and makes statements, they also read the paper that day and they see that another cabinet minister has said something quite contradictory. So the mood in Brussels, and I can elaborate on this in questions, I just want to set the scene here. The mood in Brussels is confusion, don't really understand what the UK really wants, and don't understand how the UK is going to deliver it. So my job as a British MEP in the Parliament is to convince my colleagues that there is a way forward and it's a sensible one, and I really look forward to hearing what very eminent people here have got to say about how I can contribute to that.
Julie, thank you very much for that insight into the view from Brussels and your colleagues. Someone from the Royal Society described David Davis's position paper on science and its approach to science in terms of Brexit as like a winter jumper, warm and woolly. Graeme, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Thank you, Palab, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So I'd like to do three things. I'd like to, first of all, just do a very quick assessment of our relationship with Europe within the scientific domain. I'd then like to cover some of the things that I think we will work through, and then finally come up to some things that I fret about because I don't think that I see them being worked through. So I have spent my adult life in a debate about Europe, and my sense is that this country, for the last 40 years, has had really quite a difficult and divisive relationship with Europe. Meanwhile, the scientific community have had a consistently harmonious and constructive relationship with Europe. And I'll come back to the difference between public opinion and the science community in a moment. The harmony and consistency, I think, is an entirely rational response from the scientific community. Europe has provided an environment with wonderful structures for collaboration, which means that if you want to enter a new research collaboration, you do not negotiate it from scratch. You build on quite sophisticated and now mature foundations and only negotiate the little bit at the top that applies to your project. What's more, the EU lubricates these collaborations with bits of money, making the member state community an extraordinarily fertile place for scientific collaboration. In the business community, and bear in mind that 2/3 of research in the UK is done in business, in the business community there has been a strikingly lower level of participation in the EU. 1% of business expenditure on R&D comes from the EU. So there is a very big difference between the behaviour of the academic community and the behaviour of the business community. And there's an interesting debate to be had about why businesses in the UK, particularly big business that does most of the research, why big businesses in the UK participate in EU programmes at a much lower level than some of their European counterparts. And there's questions about whether there are things that the government has done or not done over a generation or more to lead us to that position. Shortly after the 2015 election, when it was clear we were going to have a referendum, the Campaign for Science and Engineering did what I think was one of the first polls of the community to try to get some sense of the mood. And when the results came back, it turned out that 93% of people supported the continued relationship with the EU. And when the office saw that data, they thought there was something wrong with the methodology on the basis that you don't get 93% of people to agree on anything in this country. Actually, it was a simple poll. The methodology was robust, and it was a first glimpse of this very strong support for Europe in the science community. Now, I'm actually not too worried about continuation of funding, because the very worst that can happen is that we end up with about £1 billion a year more than we had on the day of the referendum, because the increases in the UK domestic budget outweigh even the widest sweep of definition of what comes in from the EU. So at a national level, that doesn't really worry me. The citizenship issue is well defined, and if I'm an optimist, I would say that it will get worked through. And this week's statement from the Home Office was a sign of shifting ground, even among the hardliners there. So these aren't really bits that worry me a lot. But I am worried about three things. First of all, this national picture of healthy funding masks huge variations inside the research community, and in particular masks elements of the research community that have got very high codependency with Europe. So, for example, if you look at technicians in Russell Group universities, 27% of technicians in clinical medicine have come from other parts of Europe. 39% of academics in economics come from other parts of Europe. And 38% of research funding in archaeology comes from the EU. The Healthy UK picture disguises all of that. These are existential threats to research disciplines. EU structural funding is also concentrated in certain parts of the country. In Wales, there is 8 times as much structural funding per capita as there is in England. So feeling comfortable about a national picture is not the same as feeling comfortable. If you remove all these relationships in one go, I think we end up with a research base that has some of the characteristics of Swiss cheese. It's got funny holes in it in unpredictable places. 2 quick things, because I sense Palab's body language. I remain concerned about whether we will keep science at the negotiating table. I think the government have been consistent in their support for science and consistently put science at the negotiating table, but it's always under threat from the big politics. And finally, the thing that worries me most of all, and which we heard a little bit about earlier, is the impact that all this is having on the UK's reputation in the world, not just in the EU, our reputation as a trusted partner and a voice of reason. And while most of the other things I've talked about are essentially technical issues that you can work through, they're reasonably easy to define and reasonably easy to work through if you've got the political will. If you lose a reputation, it can take more than a generation to bring it back.
Graeme, thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut
No,
you short.
you're all right. I was overrunning.
The observation that I'd make is just playing the David Davis role here, is that if people are polled on whether they would like to continue receiving £8 million a year, I'm sure 93% must be a cause for concern, because what are the other 7% voting against? The other observation that I'd make is that just after Brexit, Sir Paul Nurse, former president, your boss and former president of the Royal Society, said that science can only flourish if there's free movement of people, to which Jeremy Farrar, head of the Wellcome Trust, said science can only flourish if it has the consent of the people. And so that's the difficulty that we have. Could I ask James to speak?
So thank you very much. So as Palab said, I'm a research scientist. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity of giving a perspective from a scientist. So in my day job, I lead a team of researchers interested in how the central nervous system forms before birth, so the brain and the spinal cord. We're asking fundamental questions, how you turn a fertilized egg into an individual, but it also has implications for conditions such as spina bifida, spinal cord injury, diseases such as motor neuron disease. So my team comprises 16 scientists. They're from a variety of disciplines, so there's biologists, physicists, computer scientists. Three of my team are from the UK, 10 are from other EU nationalities, and 3 are from outside of the European Union. So we're funded by a variety of sources, so UK agencies such as the Medical Research Council, the BBSRC, and charities such as the Wellcome Trust. But also a substantial amount of our funding is international. I have a European Research Council grant, which is worth about £2 million over 5 years, and also collaborative grants with other European colleagues, and also with US colleagues, in that case jointly funded by the US National Science Foundation. So the situation of my team is very similar to the broader position of the Francis Crick Institute. As you know, the Crick is a large biomedical and new biomedical discovery institute. We're really dedicated to trying to understand the fundamental biology underlying health and disease. We're addressing the big questions and the big health challenges. So cancer, heart disease, dementia, birth defects, infectious diseases. in our institute, 44% of our researchers are EU nationals from outside the UK. We've actually just completed a recruitment of new group leaders. Half of the applications we received were from other European citizens. And of the 3 candidates we ended up recruiting, 1 was Swedish, 1 was Spanish, and 1 was Portuguese. So overall, I have 3 sort of fundamental concerns about the consequences of Brexit on science. So I can summarise those as people, participation and perception. So we've already touched on these. So in terms of people, really the strength of UK research rests on recruiting and retaining the very best scientists wherever they come from. And any tightening of immigration rules or introducing barriers is going to be detrimental for science and for research. In terms of participation, by our contributing to EU programmes, collaborations and facilities such as the European Research Council, it's not only the funding that we receive, but I think more important than that is the influence over the direction of research that we gain by participating in those collaborations, and the prestige and recognition that boosts the UK research effort overall. And finally, as Graeme has already touched on, I think there's a big issue about perception of the UK. The message being heard outside of the UK by my colleagues, not only in the EU but the rest of the world, is that the UK is no longer open, progressive and supportive environment for doing science. I mean, just last week I was in Heidelberg. A colleague that is originally from Singapore, working in Belgium, was thinking of applying to the Francis Crick Institute for a job. The first question he asked me is, what's the consequences of Brexit for his family? And the continuing uncertainty about the future of EU nationals that are currently living and working in the UK is harming our research now. So those 3 concerns. So what I'm really worried about is Brexit is taking those features of UK research and damaging them actively. So what can we do, or what should be done? So I think we need immediate clarity on the rights of EU citizens and their dependents that are living and working in the UK now. We should establish rules for the free movement of students, scientists and their families to maintain our ability to recruit and retain the best scientists. We should commit to fully participate in future EU research programmes and facilities now, so we can continue to participate as they're being developed for the next few years. And I think being here today and bearing in mind that the European Parliament has a vote on the final Brexit deal, I think MEPs could play a key role in championing research across the EU and the UK, from everything from the regulations like clinical trials, drug licensing, but also maintaining the collaborative environment that's been so beneficial not only to the UK but science within Europe generally. So I think MEPs have a crucial role in supporting the priorities not only for the UK but also for European science, particularly as the Brexit negotiations draw to a conclusion.
James, thank you very much indeed. I'd just add that David Davis's position paper is in favour of all the things that you've mentioned, but it lacks information on his detail as to
Absolutely.
How to achieve those things.
All warm words are very nice, but let's see the detail.
Yes. Helen, could I ask you for your observations, please?
Good morning. I too am glad to have the opportunity to take part in this conversation. And let me say at the outset that my definition of science is a broad definition. You would expect me to say that. I'm from the British Academy, which is the champion of humanities and social sciences. But let's recognise the importance of the humanities and social sciences in this story. The humanities and social sciences have been even more successful than the life sciences in extracting funding and success from the European funded programme. So we're a very important part of the scenery. Let me also say, just prompted by the last thing that James said and Palab's responses, we're talking about 2 Brexit negotiations. Let's be clear, as Julie said, There's the immediate settlement of withdrawal, in which the issue about citizens' rights from other countries and so on is obviously crucial. But then there's the follow-on arrangements, and it's only then that we'll get to the longer-term issues about how far the UK will or won't be involved in this or that part of science and research collaboration. Let's be clear about the context. The United Kingdom currently has some of the top performing universities in the world. They're top performing because we've been successful in attracting talent, both students and faculty, and, as Graeme says, technicians and laboratory assistants to an extraordinary extent. And we can't assume that we will maintain that international status and standing in the absence of being plurinational and full of talented people. It is the case that UK higher education institutions have been spectacularly successful, people like James and their European Research Council grants, and many of the people from UK-based institutions who've won that success, of course, are not British nationals. They're people from other European countries. And let me just say a word about the money, because I think it's, forgive me, Palab, but it's a little cynical to say 93% would vote for the money, wouldn't they? I think we're voting for something which is not only about money, and I think, as Graeme has indicated, maybe not mainly about money. It's the kind of money and the conditions attached to European money that are really important. And what's special about European funding programmes? They're nationality blind. They depend on a competition to identify excellence by international competitive standards. They insist on collaboration as part of the deal, and they insist on mobility as part of the deal. So all of those conditions are really important. And on the nationality part, I'm sure everybody here, probably everybody in this room, will applaud the case for giving nationals of other European economic area countries the opportunity to continue to work in the UK. But for the moment, we're only talking about those that are currently here. There's a further set of issues down the road about what the outlook is for people in 2, 3, 4 years' time. And it's not only about those individuals, important though they are, it's about the character of a research community and the benefits of plurinationality. Let me also just stress the point about international peer review. We do have other funding streams through the United Kingdom mechanisms, but then don't build in international peer review as an automatic part of the process in the way that the European funding ones do. James and Graeme have talked about collaboration as being essential, the building of partnerships as being essential. Of course, what the European funding programmes provide is an opportunity to find your most appropriate partners in other countries. But let me add, because it's easy to kind of caricature this as a kind of Europeans and only Europeans. There's also some back-to-back arrangements with research communities in other countries as well as those inside Europe. So the question for me is how far UK instruments post-Brexit would be able to ensure that the kind of core conditions that I've talked about can be sustained with, I would obviously hope, as close as possible a relationship with the future European Union programmes. Let me add something else. The regulatory framework also matters tremendously. How research is conducted. People here will know about clinical trials, animal experiments and so on, which are subject to various rules. What research can be conducted and how issues about data access and so on which is European legislation. What happens to the results of research, patents, intellectual property, all subject to European regulation. And issues about the framing of the environment. My daughter works across the square in DEFRA running an air pollution team. All of the environmental and other legislation, which may not appear to be specifically about research, has implications both for what research is conducted and how it's to be taken forward. And let me just say, because I've followed it closely, Julie, the scientific evidence issue is a really important one. And quite some efforts are being made to improve the quality of science advice in the policy process in a European context at the moment, and that's very welcome. Poor Nurse is in the middle of that. And I've watched as a gardener who regularly breaks European law. the discussion about glyphosate and when and whether and how its licence is or isn't to be extended. So there's all kinds of issues there which are about the context of research as well as the funding programmes. And is the European Parliament important in this process? You bet it's important, because it's very important, in particular for things like the citizens' rights, but also for the regulatory process in which the European Parliament makes a great deal of difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I just say that I'm here to give voice to David Davis, so in some ways it's my job to be cynical. Also, as a journalist, I think I've got a head start on cynicism as well. Our final introductory remarks is Lord Taverne. Dick.
Okay. I'm deeply sceptical about the government's promises about what will happen after Brexit, because on the face of it, they've promised a very generous new funding, but we're going to face a very difficult position. I would hate to be the Chancellor before the next budget, because the economic situation is worsening. There'll be no room for elaborate relaxation or austerity. There's going to be very strong cuts in public services, and there must be some question about whether the science budget, which they've outlined, is going to be immune to the difficulties the government faces. And generally speaking, I'm sceptical because ever since the referendum, there's been an extraordinary complacency about the government's policy and attitude. They've always assumed that they're over-optimistic about the future. It's going to be these sunny uplands the moment that we've left the European Union. Enormous over-optimism about the bonanza of free trade deals that will be done, especially now that one, I suppose, with a lot of support from that great champion of free trade and champion of America first, Donald Trump. So, and lastly, I'm sceptical about their optimism about future collaboration and participation in shared facilities, and in the effect it's going to have on the survival of the talent which we have attracted to this country. I very much echo what's already been said. All around one hears these stories. The government says, oh, well, there's no hard evidence, just a lot of anecdotal evidence. Well, the anecdotal evidence is very convincing and very strong, because everywhere you hear stories about foreigners who no longer think this is a country in which they want to live. We have become a nastier country because people are now prepared to indulge in unashamed public display of xenophobia. And you get this abuse of foreigners. Go home. And children at their schools are being teased and abused. So the atmosphere is one in which they no longer like to live in this country. And I'm very doubtful if we will continue to attract the kind of talent we've attracted in the past, when in fact we haven't become a country which the Europeans find very attractive. And as for the collaboration, well, of course we could contract, we could join in projects in the Horizon programme, the 2020 Horizon programme, but we'll no longer be represented on the panel which adjudicates on projects, and that's going to be a very major disadvantage. My second point is that I think there'll be no deal. I think the timetable for the deal is absolutely impossible. Within 2 years, we've got to have a new deep and whatever it is, and novel and deep relationship with the European Union. And this relationship will be far more difficult to negotiate than the Canadian free trade agreement, which took 7 years. And we've got to conclude this within less than a year and a half, because not only have we got a limit of 2 years, but all the European parliaments the 27 parliaments have to ratify, which would take at least 4 months. Now, the government has recognised that and is now saying, OK, we'll go for transition. But transition to what? because we still don't know what the final objective is, because the government is absolutely fundamentally, and it seems almost irreconcilably, divided about what it aims at. There's the soft Brexiteers. They also want to leave, say we'll leave the customs union and the single market. But the others are not in the least worried about the effect of leaving the customs union and single market. So they're quite happy to be reconciled to WTO terms, which would not be very happy ones for the future of our science, because it'll affect a lot of the businesses, especially who feel this is falling off a cliff. So I don't think there'll be a no deal, because the irreconcilable differences inside the Conservative Party and the hopelessness of a timetable, which is really would demand a miracle. And lastly, if one thinks this is a very gloomy scene, there is an upside to it, namely, I think it is quite possible that with no deal, there'll be no Brexit. At the end of the show, at the end of the negotiations, Parliament must have a vote that's been reluctantly conceded by the government. And what will the vote be? They say accept or reject. What happens if you say reject no deal? What does that mean? Go back and negotiate again? It's impossible. So in effect there'd be no choice unless you have a real choice, which Parliament will insist on, which would be to give the people a second chance to have a vote. Now that development depends very much on the change in public opinion. Been a very slight change so far in public opinion only. But I think if one looks at the future, the prospect of no customs union is going to be devastating for manufacturing industry. All right, the government say, oh, we'll have a frictionless border. This would be and a new brilliant tech, IT innovation. Well, I mean, this is for the birds, because nobody has explained exactly what this brilliant innovation is going to be, or how the frictionless border is going to be achieved. And as far as the Irish problem is concerned, I think the Northern Irish problem is frankly insoluble. I think we're bound to have a hard border, and that's going to have very grave implications indeed. And I think that there's a lot of bad news on the way. I can't see that I can see awful problems with the pound in the future. I think that when the results of Brexit become plainer, and nearly all the news about Brexit, almost every day we get some new news about Brexit and how damaging it's going to be to the British economy. I think when that is accepted, when it's realized, when the prospect of no deal is realized by the foreign currency traders, I think we'll have a further drop in the pound. And although it's true that polls show that most of those who voted leave voted because they wanted control and didn't care very much about the economic consequences, it's also true that they had very optimistic views about what their future would be after Brexit. And if, in fact, it comes to the point at which they find that their jobs are at stake, that, in fact, their families are going to be more impoverished, which I think is the likelihood, the probability, then I think it is also far from impossible that they will turn against Brexit, that MPs will no longer feel constrained, as it were, to observe the referendum verdict, because the referendum verdict will no longer represent the will of the people. So I think there is a not inconceivable chance. It's a very uncertain field, so I don't know what is going to happen. Obviously, nobody can predict. But I think there's a far from impossible chance that, in fact, we'll have no Brexit.
Dick, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panellists for the introductory comments. I mean, they're very pessimistic, gloomy, just wondering how on earth we're going to see ourselves through this. Perhaps Dick's was the most optimistic from his point of view that maybe it won't happen. But I suppose that the observations, I'll open it up to the floor. The way I'm going to do it is I'm not going to have one question and then everyone answer that question and then another question, because that's just really boring. I'm going to invite a series of questions and comments, because we've got an expert audience as well as an expert panel. So do make your observations. We'll take a few comments and then we'll come back to the panel for their observations. Don't feel you've got to answer every single question, just the ones that interest you. So for my observations, if it was just about the impact of science, I don't think British people would have voted to leave the European Union. It wasn't about just science. It was about the fact that membership of the European Union was not working for the majority. So that's why, and it's in that context that all these arguments have to be framed. I also wonder whether some of the arguments here have been a little bit overstated. Clearly, you know, this is your livelihoods and you care about the people that you work with. But, you know, universities do have students from non-EU countries and researchers from non-EU countries. Science will continue if we're outside of the European Union. There are various arrangements to get money from Horizon 2020 programmes that may well continue. And the other thing is, just going back to the first point about the membership of the European Union not working for the vast majority. We, all of us, are in a bubble. The House of Lords, the European Parliament, the British Academy, Francis Crick Institute, our universities. Do we, you know, perhaps we do have to look a little further and try and make Brexit work for science and for the United Kingdom. Anyway, those are just some thoughts that you might wish to address. But so just put your hands up and we'll come to you. That gentleman there, followed by that gentleman there. Yes, if you could say who you are and where you're from.
Andrew Mackenzie from the Physiological Society. Thank you. That was a very interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on that last point you made, and it's really a legitimacy question, in that I think pretty much all of us in this room here would have been against Brexit. But is there a problem when a majority, whether we like it or not, a majority of the population voted to leave the European Union? And so many conversations with the science community is about how a majority of the people in the country made a mistake and that we're looking for ways to try and reverse the decision that was made. And my worry is that when the frame of the conversation is entirely around why a majority of the British population were wrong in how they voted, then that leaves us in a very difficult place when we are trying to get legitimacy for science in the UK.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, and if there's someone on the side that wants to make a comment, put your hands up.
Thank you, Palab. I'm Steve Lambert. I'm a Buckinghamshire County Council. And while I'm a Liberal Democrat, I don't necessarily agree with Lord Taverne, but two Liberal Democrats in the room, we're bound to have a different opinion. I represent Buckinghamshire and I'm one of 49 councillors for the whole of the 500,000 people that are there. But an interesting part of our economy is it's the home of British rocket science. It is the home of the propulsion technology industry that got the Juno missions, the Voyager missions, the Thunderbird rocket stuff. We have Nycomed or Amersham GE Medical in Amersham. We have Stoke Mandeville Healthcare, which deals with global high-tech health industries. Buckinghamshire voted to leave the European Union, much to my shock and horror. The residents that I represent in particular are the kind of people who were being done to, the people who really had enough of the whole European project and weren't told enough about it. I have my head screwed on slightly, I hope, and I understood the impact on science and technology and on those jobs that aren't scientists, but actually are the people that support the scientists and the engineers at places like Westcott and Amersham and at Stoke Mandeville and Silverstone. The question now is, what next for them? Because I get the point. All of you industries and in the bubbles, as you said, Palab, actually, you probably will find a way forward. There probably will be international collaboration after Brexit, and I do think we will end up in a Brexit position. I think we'll go back. I think, you know, we'll leave, and probably in 5 years' time we'll have a massive campaign to stay in again. The impact on engineering and science in my world, where I represent the highest deprivation index in part of the southeast of the country, is the knock-on effect. If you can't do your jobs properly, doing the science, doing the DNA work and that sort of stuff, those are my residents that are not getting helped. Those are my residents that don't have jobs. So my question is, really, as a thought process is, as a county council, I'm doing my best to get the industry into Buckinghamshire. I'm selling it as big as I can. I'm trying to get you guys to stay. And yet I'm hearing constantly, well, in 2 years' time, we're off. We just can't raise our heads above the parapet and tell the government that yet because they're frightened of the consequences. The question is, what next for the little people?
Thank you. And
yeah, I'm Roberto Di Lauro. I'm science attaché at the Italian embassy. Let me tell you that science attaché, Italian science attaché, are not diplomats. So they are scientists. So I'll make an undiplomatic comment and I'll ask a question. The undiplomatic comment coming from Italy, I have to tell you that when I came here, I was full of admiration for the British system. As Ms. Sterling was saying, I have made some of the comments that she has made, coming from a country where the political debate is a real mess and evidence-based is not really our way of moving forward. I was really admiring the British system, and now I understand that we are not so different. Right, so my question is, how likely it is, since there is such a great consensus among scientific communities, and I can see it with the Italian scientific community and the British scientific community, we like to stay together. How likely it is that the deal is done, putting science and research first, and the deal is made so that everything, at least in science and research, stays the way it is?
Okay, so let's come back to the panel. Two of the points were following on from my comments, just trying to, whether just bemoaning is the right approach, or whether we should try and engage in the context that we are leaving the European Union and trying to make it work. And then we'll come to your question as to how we try and do that. Can I start with Dick? You think everyone got it wrong, don't you?
Yes. But now, as far as public opinion is concerned, it is obviously unpredictable. There are a few signs that are changing. First of all, the last poll showed a very slight, minor 2% lead for the Remain camp. Okay, that's neither here nor there. But I think there's going to be quite a lot of developments which will impinge on the ordinary person, a lot of whom voted no, who voted to leave. First of all, look at the effect on the health service if we don't have EU nurses anymore. 17% of our nurses are EU nurses, and in fact, 94%, the EU nurses' application to serve in the health service has been reduced by 94%. And say, okay, we will train our own. It takes 2 years to train nurses, and a lot of them are now leaving. The building trade, the programme for houses depends on a million houses to be built in the next few years. That needs an increase in the workforce, the construction workforce, of 35%. Because a lot of the Poles and Lithuanians are leaving, the forecast is that there will be a decrease in the workforce of 6%. Wherever you look, there are going to be effects of Brexit, or the anticipation of Brexit, of the kind which will affect public opinion. I think iconic to the sort of no voters is the manufacturing side is the car trade, for example. Now, if there's no customs union, it's going to have a devastating effect at the borders on people who are dependent on the sort of integrated parts cycle which they depend on, because there are going to be delays. Well, delays of only hours are going to make a huge difference to the cost of exporting cars. And in fact, there are a lot of grumbles and a lot of signs that Nissan no longer believes in the undertakings they were given. Honda is worried. They don't tell their workforce yet. All the car manufacturers are now worried about the future of their position because it will no longer be profitable to manufacture cars. That will affect a lot of jobs, and that will affect public opinion. So I think there will be a change. Will public opinion follow science because of the importance of science? Of course not. But I think a lot of things will affect people who are worried about this, the reduction in living standards of their families. And if that happens, I think the atmosphere in Parliament will happen. Remember that 4/5 of parliamentarians voted in the referendum, voted Remain.
Thank you, Dick. Julie, just to address the point, what is the best tactic given the backdrop? We will be leaving the European Union. We don't know quite how we're going to be leaving it. How do we negotiate the best deal for science? You were talking about an absence of detail and granularity, but what are you trying to do?
Well, I could sit here and talk about why I think leaving Europe's a bad idea. I'd just like you to take it as read that that's what I think. So I'm not going to go through any more detail on that. But for me, I'm looking at the future, and I think the role in the European Parliament is that we have to convince our European colleagues that we haven't gone European. The irony of this, of course, is we've become much more European since Brexit politically, as our Italian friend said. So my job is to make sure that we stop poisoning the well, your last P, I think, of perception, that we start to improve that. And it's a really difficult thing to do when you come to the table with my views on Brexit. So I think we all have to... politicians are good at this, though. That's what you pay us for, is to run a dual track. So whilst I think the whole thing is entirely bonkers, I also think that it's my job to try to rescue things from the fire. And doing that in the European Parliament is really important, because in the end we do have a vote. I need to settle my colleagues to say, no, it hasn't all gone mad in the UK. And that's where the science community is so important, because you have been really valuable so far in the debate in Brussels. There's been an awful lot of lobbying done in Brussels by the UK Science Committee and community, and I think that should continue. And I and my colleagues in the Parliament are there to facilitate the continuing of that if we can, with events. We've just set up, I've just organised with my Committee on Environment an event on Brexit where we are asking some British academics to come and speak to us to maintain this thread of sense that Britain hasn't gone mad. We are still a good partner. We still need to be part of it. And things like the European Commission have declared that the next round of funding that replaces Horizon 2020, which we're quite right to say we would not have a part in how that's dished out, but we do still have a voice there in how that's framed. And a lot of that's going to be around defence type research, where we do very well in the UK. So again, we need to talk in Brussels about what they would lose if the UK were not part of that, and therefore why it's in their interest to facilitate. And we haven't really even, 18 months after the referendum, we aren't even in the position where we're doing that, which is what I think is so sad about the government strategy, because we're losing traction rather than being in the position now where we should be really gaining traction. But we have to continue as if we are in that position in Brussels.
And just on that very briefly, because I do want to hear from the others, we've talked about the warm words and the need for detail. What do you, as someone that's trying to hold it all together, need from DEGSU in the next few months to talk about life after Brexit?
Well, we need a little bit more of a reality check on what the difficulties are. So to stop pretending, to take the woolly jumper off and start talking about where the real problems are so that we can address them. We need to befriend our European allies. We need to do a bit of love bombing, as I think the Liberal Democrats are fond of using that phrase. That's what we need to do. We need to be saying, this is where we should be forging our new relationship. And we recognise that it's not going to be the same relationship. We have to stop pretending it's going to be the same as it was. Because it's not. It's going to be different. We have to have new mechanisms. We have to have new ways of relating. We will not be able to be the biggest recipient of the next research programme, in my view, without being a member of, at the very least, the EEA, as Norway are. So let's accept that and start talking about what we're going to do. And I think then, to take the bigger political point, and sorry, I will shut up in a minute, but to take the bigger political point about how that then ends up, I think in doing that, that's how you bring people to understand that leaving the European Union isn't going to make things better. People voted at all levels in society to leave because they thought they believed it was going to make things better. Well, if we can show that we've actually done our absolute very best to make things better, and this is what we get, which in my view won't be better, then people might start saying, OK, you've done your best. At the moment, people think they're not even trying. And they certainly think Brussels isn't trying, because that's what our press are telling them, that Brussels doesn't care and we're just trying to block. We need to get rid of all of that, move on, get real concrete stuff done, and then people can make a sensible judgment. Then I think you'll start seeing people. Unfortunately, Dick, I don't think it's logic that, if people start losing jobs, they'll think, oh, that's because we're Brexiting. They wouldn't have voted a Brexit if that sort of logic was employed. It's got to be much beyond that.
Helen, you were nodding. What do you think the way forward is now?
There's been a lot of interesting comments from the audience, as well as from other panellists. I don't think it makes sense for the science community as such to get caught in Dick's debate about Brexit or no Brexit, even though that might be something I'm interested wearing a different personal hat. My concern in this discussion is about where we situate the science community, and to say that the people were wrong about science is clearly not a sensible thing to do. I think we have to say two things as scientists. One, that science is inherently an international activity, and there are plenty of reasons for saying that, not only European, broader international. And secondly, that if you want a dynamic economy which can have innovative capacity, you need a very strong science base to breed new ideas, new thinking, new research, which will take you into innovation and will take you into a dynamic economy. Whether we're talking about the United Kingdom economy or the broader European economy, those of us who talk to colleagues in other European countries, anche gli italiani, ecco, know very well that the disappearance of the UK from the European research area would be a disaster for the European research area, because British-based scientists contribute such a lot to it. So we have friends, and this talks to Julie's points, we have friends in other parts of the European Union who actually quite want British-based science to continue to play an important part. Let me just say to Steve, I had just written down, before you made your point, relevant industries. There are many relevant industries, of which the ones you talk about in Buckingham are particularly interesting because they're a particularly advanced sector. We need those industries to be able to thrive, because your other neglected people don't have a chance of escaping from neglect. If the economy and industry doesn't prosper, and if some of that industry isn't cutting-edge high-tech, as Amersham are, and then what we need to work for, and I come back to the points about regulation, we need regulation that's helpful for your rocket industry, for Amersham, for medical devices, for pharmaceuticals. And we want to find ways of, and this is really difficult, getting British voices heard in some of that regulatory discussion, even if we're doing it from outside the room. Just to take I remember an example from the 1980s, when people were beginning to worry about carbon emissions from motor cars. And Volkswagen, it's an old story, it's an old story, fixed the then European directive so that it would say emissions controls had to depend on catalytic converters that were only produced in Germany. Now, wasn't that a coincidence? And there was a competing British technology, lean burn, that British Leyland were trying to develop, which might or might not have had a place. So I think we know we've really got to work very hard, and with the industrial community, to work in these areas.
Graeme, answer any points that you wish to that you've heard, but I'm particularly interested, with your interest in the taxpayers and their attitudes to science. Why in places like Buckingham, when there are industries that are kind of providing jobs, that people aren't realising that it's in their economic and research interests to stay within the European Union?
So,
and how can that be changed?
Let me come to that,
yes,
and if I overlook it, then you'll remind me. I just want to make a couple of observations first. There are a couple of risks about getting a group of like-minded people into a room to talk about Brexit. The first risk is that they overestimate the importance of their own domain. And the second risk is that they don't challenge the groupthink. Now, I think the science community has done a terrific job of consolidating its concerns and voicing them in a united fashion. But it would be a mistake to think that that was a compelling voice in a huge political debate. So I'm nervous when I hear people talking about a special case for science, because I actually don't think there is a special case for science. On the other hand, I think that science has got interests which are very closely aligned indeed with other parts of the wider UK community. And if you ask what's the next step and how do we keep the science interests visible, I think one response to that is to say, let's look for partners with identical or very similar interests and form alliances outside science, not just inside. I'll give you a specific example. We've heard several people mention, quite rightly, the concerns about citizenship. If you took the word science out of that and put banking in its place, you would find exactly the same concerns for exactly the same reasons from a community that is not as coherent as science, but has got greater political weight. So there is a partnership waiting to be made from a group of people that would complement our interests, but would actually be arguing for the same things for the same reasons. Coming to the Buckinghamshire point, we do have to recognise that the relationship between academic science and Europe is not the same as the relationship between business and Europe. That distinction is particularly stark when it comes to funding flows. The distinction is not obvious and probably not present when it comes to people flows. So we have to recognise that there's a different thing going on there. But although the two are different, they are codependent. And that shapes the way in which the argument is made. There are parts of the UK beyond Buckinghamshire that have got a very high technology industry base and a very strong support for Brexit. I spend a lot of time in Wales at the moment, and the semiconductor research cluster in the south of Wales is fabulous. Wales voted for Brexit. So the argument is a bit more complicated than just saying we do lots of science and science likes the EU, therefore Brexit's all wrong. We have to recognise that many businesses are operating in global marketplaces. A lot of businesses in this country operate on a transatlantic axis rather than a trans-channel axis. It doesn't for a moment dilute the importance of Brexit. It just means that the argument is a bit more, it's a bit more varied, a bit more complicated than the way it looks from an academic science point of view.
Thank you. James, just your thoughts, but could you also address the point that I made earlier in whether perhaps, bench scientists are perhaps over-egging it, for the best possible reasons, but at the Crick you have people from China, you have people from the States, you get money from all over the place, so it's not going to be the end of the world that you say it's going to be.
But the effect on the perception in the rest of the world is not limited to other EU nationals. It's seen across the world. I get this question repeatedly from colleagues from the US, from Asia. So it's the general perception. It's not simply limited to other EU nationals. And it's this perception that the UK is no longer an open, progressive, a supportive environment for doing science. So I think it's broader than just the details of the legal status of EU nationals here. It's about the perception that's sending. But I wanted to return to a couple of the points. So the legitimacy question, I think, is important, and I wouldn't presume to know any of the reasons why any individual voted the way that they did. But I think what's increasingly clear is that the Leave campaign was based on a false perspective, and it was, promoted by self-serving ideologues funded by foreign money. So it's not going to solve the problems that were promised by the Leave campaign. Reversing austerity and investing in our communities might have a better chance of answering some of those questions. And to quote, I think Palab Ghosh's new best friend, David Davis, if a democracy can't change its mind, then it isn't a democracy anymore. And then to Steve, so I actually, 20 years ago or so, I actually worked for a year for Amersham International before it became GE Healthcare. And that actually raises, so one of the things that Amersham International was doing at the time was supplying medical isotopes. And one of the consequences of Brexit is apparently we're going to withdraw from Euratom, which most people know because of its role in overseeing nuclear safety and non-proliferation. But it's also crucial for regulating the market in medical radioisotopes, which are necessary not only for medical use but also for research use. And leaving Euratom is just a crazy idea. I cannot fathom why we would do that.
Thank you. Just to hopefully answer that last question, I think it's because the European Court of Justice has jurisdiction over it.
But I mean,
which is a kind of bigger question. But anyway, let's have a few more observations and questions. Do give your observations as well as ask questions, because you're entitled to them. The lady over there, followed by the person there.
My name's Anne Corbett. I'm from the London School of Economics. The question I'd like to put, particularly to the STEM and the social scientists here, sorry about my voice, worse than Theresa May's. The question I'd like to put is to know what you know about the European politics within the scientific communities. The echoes that I get from within the university community is that they were devastated by the referendum result, but 18 months on, they are beginning to rethink quite a lot of this. And I just point to two examples where competition is now looking more important than cooperation. One is President Macron, and the other news item was that UCL has found that an awful lot of its EU staff are being offered or headhunted for jobs elsewhere. But I think that's a much wider problem. And so my conclusion is that it's actually not all that helpful to absolutely focus on Britain as top dog, the top 10 world-beating universities, because they're not world-beating on their own, and it's not only because they attract people, but it's because they are working collaboratively. And I think the scientists on the panel will quote you the figures of how much of British funded research is actually collaborative, rather than just Oxford or Cambridge or UCL or, may I say it, LSE.
Thank you. Nivian Spieth, University of Derby. I'm a social bioanthropologist, so I'm sitting here being very interested in, of course, all the industry links, talking about science from the biomedical, Francis Crick Institute aspect, and so on. But I'm wondering, from the perspective of someone whose research is very much using archaeology, and Professor Reid has mentioned that as an area under heavy threats, one of the holes in the Swiss cheese, so to say. And I'm using biomedical health. I work with clinicians. I work with social anthropologists, archaeologists, etc. Where do you see the future of interdisciplinary research in all of this? What does happen to the humanities? What is the stance of institutions such as the British Academy on trying to uphold that part of science and not let it be falling under, under any cuts that might come with the British public or government understanding science as the hard STEM sciences?
Thank you. Anyone from this side? Actually, the lady there.
Good morning. So my name's Elizabeth Crossick. I come from quite a pedigree of, I suppose, European integration on the one hand, and historians on the other, so spanning both. I just wanted to set out my credentials. I also work in Brussels, and I work for a company, a large company called Relics Group. It's a FTSE Top 30. We do information analytics, so some very specific issues around people and so on we have ourselves. But many of you in this room will know one of the companies that is part of Brexit, which is Elsevier. And obviously we have our role to play in this whole discussion. And I just want to make a couple of comments. One, I think, first of all, we maybe haven't seen how bad it will get because we are not in Brexit yet. So everybody's looking at it saying, oh, well, it's not as bad as we think it was going to be. Well, we're not there yet. So I actually think the worst is yet to come. But I do think we need to be practical as well. And whilst my heart is much in the discussions about what if and can we, and, you know, as one that was campaigning and kind of walking the streets and getting into very emotional discussions about in and out, I do think it's important that we look a little bit practically. And I know, I mean, we have just done a series of surveys together with Ipsos Mori, surveying several thousand researchers globally. So this is UK, EU, and globally US, China, Japan, and so on, asking them now their perceptions of Brexit, a certain number of time on. And it's not finished. The results are not finished. But I did want to just say a couple of things which I thought might be interesting for the debate. Sure. It's the practical things that there is a discrepancy within the research community between kind of the universities, what the universities are doing around communication and information, and what the researchers want, which are things like providing legal assistance to EU staff, covering their fees on visa applications, setting up offices to do the advice and support. UK universities are looking at this, but not hugely. EU universities are doing almost nothing at all. And we're seeing the nervous now of the researchers who are saying, all that is going on in the background, but what are you guys in the universities doing to address this and to help us to understand and navigate what is a very uncertain future?
Okay, thank you. And just one more question. Is there anyone, the gentleman there?
There's one guy at the back there who keeps...
Oh. Yes.
Was it me? Sorry. Thank
yes.
you. Hi, sorry, Joe from the Royal Society. Just kind of going back to the funding, the UK kind of performs, compared to many of our other competitors, quite well on attracting overseas investment. Now, that's not just EU funding. A lot of that is overseas business. And from a brief conversation with the ONS, we've been led to believe that the vast majority of that is from other EU nations, so EU-based businesses. What I wanted to know was kind of whether we thought that, as we've heard in terms of talent, perceptions is a massive issue in terms of attracting them, but actually money also follows on the basis of the perception. Do we think that we are in danger of possibly kind of experiencing extreme damage in terms of our R&D landscape because of the perceptions that other businesses from around the world are seeing at the moment?
Thank you, Joe. I think the answer to that's from the panel is probably yes, but I think that let's start with the points from the about interdisciplinary research and what the British Academy is doing about it. Helen.
I mean, the British Academy has been active, along with other academies like the Royal Society, in raising issues that arise from the Brexit context. And we've got another document coming out next week. We've got some stats coming out. We've showcased archaeology repeatedly, and we'll continue to do that, just as we will also make the argument that the vigour of the humanities is an important part of the research base for the creative industries, and the creative industries make a very substantial contribution to the economy. And then the question is, how do you, in a post-Brexit potential context, provide the elements that will help these areas to continue to thrive? The point about interdisciplinarity stands, whether or not we're in or outside the European Union. I mean, European programmes quite often promote interdisciplinarity, but so do national programmes, and I don't know, maybe the reconfiguration of the UK research councils will also help us in the UK context to handle some of these interdisciplinary questions. I have a son who's a mathematical biologist and has great difficulty in knowing where to assign himself in the job market and so forth. Just on Anne's point, yeah, sure, there's a lot of competitive recruitment going on. Sure, French and German labs are trying to recruit British. I'm told that one of the strongest candidates, that maybe it's been decided to be the next director of the Institut Louis Pasteur, is a British scientist. I mean, it's interesting that in other European countries, people are beginning to develop some of the characteristics that have helped UK-based institutions to thrive.
James, a point about how Britain can't rely on its tip-top reputation going forward, leaving the European Union. I just wonder if that really is the case, because I mentioned, the fact that there are collaborations with US universities, the reputation, although you're being asked the question, is Britain a good place to do science? And you're probably saying yes, and they say, oh, fine, and they're carrying on working with you. So it's... But
that would depend on what the rules are for immigration in the future, for both, not only the scientists, but their families and their dependents.
But they're unlikely to be worse than the rules for American or Chinese researchers.
They're pretty grim. The ones for non-Europeans.
I'm aware of that, but the point I'm making is collaboration does go on, research funding does go on from countries outside the EU, and the aim is to try and increase that. And maybe we're not making the most of opportunities with countries that are investing huge amounts of money in science, such as China, and making the most of relationships with the US.
Absolutely, and I think we're best placed to make the most of those within the European Union. When we think about our position in the world and position within science, looking at the interactions between the US, China, India and Europe, we end up, we're just a small damp island off the coast of Europe unless we're part of this bigger organisation. So I think we're in danger of being left behind if we don't engage fully with this. So it's very disappointing that there's no one from DexU or the government here today. Maybe it says something about where they see the priority in science, because these are crucial issues that need resolving now for people, scientists and their families from other European countries living in the UK now. Should they stay here? Should they start looking for jobs elsewhere? And there's no answer to that. The government is saying the right things, but there's no detail.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
The point made earlier that attitudes have been one of collaboration before, to some extent are shifting towards being competitive now. I think this is very true. One hears of absolutely first-class institutes like Max Planck, which are now mounting a major effort to target scientists in the UK, and it's an absolutely first-class institute. And we're going to face far harder competition than we ever had before to maintain our international status.
Just to say, I wouldn't read too much into the fact that there isn't anyone here from DexEU for science specifically, because this is a common theme in conferences that I'm invited to speak to, that it's very hard to get anyone from government to come and talk at the moment. It's because unless you get the Secretary of State, who is the only one who's allowed to say anything, the officials simply are, it's not their fault. They're simply not able to offer anything speculative. They can only speak from the papers which are in the public domain anyway. So I wouldn't say that it's because science is not important to them. I'd say it's because this level of communication at the moment is not welcome and comfortable for them.
It's not entirely reassuring.
No, I'm sure. But I just wanted to be a little bit optimistic about the fact that I do think there is a strong voice for science in government, as there is in Brussels. And I just want to thank Anne for her point, because I think it's really important. It's stupid to pretend that competition doesn't exist between academic institutions and in the research community in the same way as it does in business. And to me, that's one of the fundamental reasons why we shouldn't leave, because we are stronger together. And yes, we could be working with the US and China, but there are collaborative things we can do. But in the end, we as a bloc, if you like, as European science, are to some extent in competition with the US and China. So what Brexit is saying is we're moving our face away from being part of the European bloc to being what? A little bit of the American bloc and a minute bit of anything that's going on in China. That's the stupidity of it, the political stupidity of it. But again, you know, we're in our bubble talking to each other on that. What do we do about that? Well, I think we have to make sure that the close relationship that we have as being an important part of the European bloc is mended and built on as soon as possible.
Julie, thank you very much. Let me just take a few more questions because we've just got 5 minutes left. This gentleman here, and did you want to speak?
My name is Matteo Natalucci, reporter for Global Data, and previously I was working in policy and partnership for the UN Environment in Brussels to the Commission. My question is regarding once the UK, as one of the points of the UK leaving the EU, it was not to be compelled to EU regulations. But from a digital perspective, now the UK is going toward the GDPR. Is going toward an integration with the border, with Schengen, especially with China, and others, I would say, digital policies as well in customs union. So my question is, what is the UK strategy toward digital in a post-Brexit scenarios, compliance-wise with the EU?
So I don't think anyone can answer that on this panel, I'm afraid.
Hi, this is Antti from University of Warwick. It's more of a comment actually on the impact on Brexit on research. So my research is on anti-corruption, and I got a grant, and my grant was to study the impact of the International Anti-Corruption Summit, which took place last year. And part of that research was to also have a collaboration with a department in the UK government. But the research grant was gotten before Brexit, and we agreed that I would spend there sometimes to do the research. And actually, after the vote, I was told because of my nationality, I didn't pass the security. So therefore, that's having some sort of an impact on what future research is, and I don't think that's a very welcoming for the future. Although some nice comments were made.
Thank you very much. A couple more comments. Just wait if you can wait for the microphone and explain who you are.
Hello, Rumi Vakirelska. I'm a science journalist in the city, in city publications. So actually, city journalists now, namely Standard & Poor's and Progressive Media Group titles, which cover a lot of the impact of Brexit as a result of the exit of Euratom, the exit of the European Space Agency. So we have become, over the last year, not exactly city journalists, but science journalists because of the weaknesses in the industrial strategy. So actually, there are people like us in the business-to-business high-end publications which are meeting in their daily content the impact of Brexit on science and business. It might be something to look forward to put as a content, as a UK position. That could be very beneficial. And secondly, I'm sorry I was late. I didn't hear a lot of data on the impact of Brexit on science, but want to point out that last year's CBI conference, and the data is very easy to access, had excessive data on the impact of Brexit on science, especially in the impact of Euratom's exit in all its aspects, from nuclear power to medicine, and the exit of the European Space Agency. This year's CBI conference on Monday didn't provide, it was entitled A World of Opportunity, and it had close to zero about the impact of science and the impact of Brexit on science and engineering. So I think it's very important that this agenda on the impact of Brexit on science linked with business is put forward, and such
Sure.
as the honourable member of the
I should
panel.
just correct you that the UK isn't leaving the European Space Agency. And also, I'm delighted that one positive effect of Brexit is the fact that there are more science journalists. I'll just take two more observations. I don't think there are any real questions there.
Juliet Parry, Kingston University. I wanted to observe something about the earlier discussion about the man on the street. I don't think that your average man on the street has much understanding at all about the EU, what it does and how it really affects them. I certainly know that before I started working in something that had something to do with it, I didn't. I think the man on the street has been affected by the fact that they're not happy about a variety of things about living conditions and economy. They don't understand how it's affected, but they do know that they have lived all of their lives, certainly if they're the same age as me, with bad news stories about the EU, and all the EU does is make us have our bananas straighter. I remember from my childhood, and that sort of story. There've been a lot of easy targets for the press over the years, and that has affected a lot of us in our perception of the EU. And I think that is why when people got the opportunity to look at the EU through the referendum, there was a backlash, and that getting out of that might help. I also think that much as there's been a lot of excellent work in trying to consolidate the science base and lobby government with it, when that gets into the press, it's actually having a negative effect, and we're getting much more of a scientists in their ivory towers don't really understand the real world effect. So I'd like to challenge the panel, what can we as individuals do now, today when we go home, outside of that consolidating science and its position to the government, what can we do to help the man on the street understand?
Okay, so 2-sentence answers from each of you. Dick. 2 sentences.
The big question is going to be, things are going to get worse. Who will be blamed? And how do we stop it being Brexit, being Brussels that'll get all the blame? I think the hopeful sign is that the total incompetence and chaos in the government is going to mean that one source of anti-European propaganda, which always has some effect, is what the government thinks, is no longer going to be a source for the people's verdict. Sorry, it's not quite one sentence, but I think that there will be a different attitude towards this question because of the total chaos and attitude to the government.
Thank you. Julie.
I think it's about trying to change the debate to let's remember things were going to get better when we leave the EU. Not scrabble around trying to make sure they can stay the same. They're actually supposed to get better. So it's framing any conversations we have with people around, well, do you feel that your life is getting better, and in what way? Because that, I totally take your analysis, I mean, on why it happens. So the opposite has to be, okay, is it getting better, or is it actually getting worse with Brexit? And I think mostly people would think it's actually getting worse. But then I need to do my job in Brussels and make them cheer up and start being a bit more positive, because unfortunately the narrative's changing too. It's all their fault because they're not helping us. So those two things.
Helen, what can people do once they leave the room?
I just think we need to make a distinction between the general Brexit question, which I feel strongly about, but I'm not wearing that hat today, I'm wearing a different hat, and the science-related discussion. On the science-related discussion, we have to tell it, if I may, there are more women on the street than men. We need to tell the women on the street stories about the science part that help to promote an understanding of what will be needed to safeguard the success of the British science base in a potentially post-Brexit context. And I actually think, and I say this not only to be nice to James, telling that story about the life sciences is the quickest and easiest way to do it, because if you can show that international, not only European, international collaboration helps you to address life-threatening conditions, or indeed planet-threatening conditions, you can get easy, straightforward sound bites that are very convincing, and we all need some stories to tell, even though I might think the archaeology story or the whatever is one that I would, because I belong somewhere else. And let me also, just one other thing if I may, so the point about the European Space Agency is very distressing. We are not leaving the European Space Agency. It is not an EU organisation. There are many, fortunately, European collaborative frameworks. EMBO, the Molecular Biology Organisation, is another one, CERN, the physics, of which Britain has been a founder member, has a strong part to play and will continue, I hope, to play a part in those. And we must not allow the Brexit debate to hijack the word European and attach it only to the European Union.
Thank you, Helen. Sorry to cut you short. Graeme.
I think it's a great mistake if we construct this debate about what it is that science takes from Europe and what science is in the effect of Brexit on science. There's another dimension that has not come out today, which is about the contribution that science has made and will continue to make to public policy development at a time when we're going to see an unprecedented level of reform to regulation and law as we leave the EU. That is why the Department for International Trade recruited a chief scientific advisor whose appointment was announced the other day. It's why DexEU recruited a chief scientific advisor, sadly too late to inform them about the implications of leaving Euratom, but there you go. And actually, it's, I suspect, going to be one of the bigger items on the desk of Patrick Vallance as he moves into the role of government chief scientific advisor. We're going to see a demand placed on science and an opportunity for science to contribute to legal and regulatory reform in the UK on an unprecedented scale over a period that might last for most of a generation. And I think that should be factored into the scientific dimension of Brexit instead of it appearing as if we are just chasing research grants.
From the view from the bench, what should
so,
people
I
do?
mean, the questions and problems that we face are universal. They don't respect national boundaries. And the questions we try to address as scientists has the potential to improve all of our lives. But solving these does require international collaboration, and it requires the friction-free movement of people and ideas. Let's not go backwards.
Thank you all. Just very quickly, yes.
I think to address the common man, as it were, and woman, I think that that we should stress very strongly that Brexit is making the problems of the National Health Service much worse.
Thank you all to our panel. I think that we've had a fascinating discussion. For what it's worth, just my observations as a journalist who's covering it, I think your voices are being heard and you are making a difference. I think that my impression is that government does care deeply at the highest level what happens to science. It was just days after Theresa May was elected in the whole chaos of Brexit and leadership elections that she wrote a letter to Sir Paul Nurse saying that it was her highest priority. And let's not dismiss the value of warm words. I think that, I don't think David Davis has many answers, but he's got to be helped by the conversations we have here. So I think you're all doing your bit, and thank you all very much for coming along. Thanks very much. Thanks to our panel.